Now, Isaac, if you don't mind, let's dive into the delta neutral farming strategy breakdown, whatever you want to call it. Maybe just start off explaining to people what it is, and then like maybe how to go about like setting up something that will be good for them.
All right, so we're going to talk briefly, very briefly, on delta neutral yield farming. Now, delta neutral yield farming, in its truest sense, is basically impossible, almost impossible. I would say for practical reasons, impossible, and maybe for legal reasons, it's impossible. But what you can do is pseudo delta neutral yield farming, which is as close as you can get to delta neutral yield farming as humanly possible within the bounds of the laws of physics and mathematical science. But the basic idea of what pseudo delta neutral yield farming, and I'll probably say just delta neutral yield farming, but I mean pseudo delta neutral. What you're trying to do is you're trying to put in a certain amount of usually USDC or just some sort of dollar, derivative into an investment. And no matter what the markets do, you want to be able to pull out the exact same amount of dollar derivative as you put in. So you want to have no loss. Delta is a word that in finance means the difference between an asset and a derivative asset. For these purposes, delta is going to mean the difference between a asset and the investment value of an asset. Okay, so even though in finance circles, this could be like if you have a dollar derivative or something and you invest into it, you want to make sure that dollar derivative remains close to whatever your investment was in dollars. In this, it's going to mean basically you have a dollar amount that you put into an investment and you want to be able to extract that same dollar amount with time being a non-factor. Of course, that's never going to be exactly correct, but you want to approximate this. That is the idea of delta neutral yield farming. Why is this useful? Well, it's useful for multiple reasons. One is simply you are a low risk investor. Of course, that seems to be a minority of people within crypto because everybody here is such a degen, but there is a small minority, I would say, that actually do care about very low risk in their investments, but they still want to be in crypto. Let's say you hold a lot of crypto assets. You're not really sure how the market's going to go. Probably a smart idea for you to find some sort of investment where you can guarantee a interest on it. So your money's not just sitting there doing nothing, but you could still pull out the same value of your investments and you don't want to have exposure to the market. So yeah, there's plenty of reasons why you want to do delta neutral yield farming. And when you do it, there are basically, I found kind of like two generic ways of doing delta neutral yield farming. This one kind of sucks though, borrow farming. And I would not recommend doing it because it still leaves you a lot of exposure. But the essential idea of borrow farming is that, let's say you have like $400 USDC position, you do a 2x leverage ETH USDC position, and you borrow $400 worth of ETH. And if you do this, you're technically not short any asset, but you still have exposure to a $400 borrowed ETH position. And I think the key to good delta neutral yield farming is being as hedged as possible. So you have as little exposure to kind of like these borrowed assets as you can. And if you do, you balance it out with other positions from other borrowed assets. So to understand that, let's get into this at first seemingly kind of complex delta neutral position that you can actually set up on Francium. And it's actually an example that Francium has on their website. So if you want to find it, you can go onto there. We're not endorsing Francium on this, but they're just a really useful learning opportunity. And I have used them in the past. I haven't used them recently though. So explaining this, let's say you have 400 USDC. You take 100 of that USDC and you invest it into a 3x leverage ETH USDC position. And you borrow USDC to make that position work. So a 3x position is 100 USDC into ETH USDC position. 3xing it means you have to borrow 200 USDC in order to make this position work. And in Francium, you can decide which asset to borrow, either ETH or USDC. So now you have 200 borrowed USDC, and you have 100 USDC for a position with a total value of 300 USDC. Now, in order to make a ETH USDC position, you need ETH, obviously. So in order to do that, you're going to have to take 150 of your borrowed USDC and buy Ethereum. So by buying Ethereum with 150 of your borrowed USDC, you're now short $150 worth of ETH. Okay, so your short position is $150 worth of ETH. Now, you might be saying, well, I don't get this because I don't understand anything about finance, and you're talking to me about shorting and longing like I would have a pre-existing knowledge of that. Well, to understand that, you have to understand what shorting is. And essentially all shorting is, at least for these practical purposes, is that you are going to take an asset, borrow it, and then sell it into another asset. Oh, and sorry, I said short, I meant long on the 150 ETH US. So I meant long. Because what you're doing is to short, you have to buy or borrow an asset and then sell that asset for something else, okay? In this first example, we borrowed 100 USDC, and then we used 150 of that to buy Ethereum. So by borrowing USDC and buying ETH, we are now short USDC and long ETH. And the reason for that is because when the value of dollars goes up or down, when we are borrowing it, we have to repay whatever that value is. So $200 you borrow, you have to pay back $200. That's how that works. So when you buy another asset, you are now no longer exposed to the value of your borrowed asset. So when you buy Ethereum, you now are holding Ethereum, but you still owe $200. So if the value of Ethereum goes from $200, let's say, to $400, you could sell your Ethereum, pay back your borrowed position, and still have $200 left behind. So you are making the difference between the two. Now, if Ethereum were to drop from 200 to 100, and you sold the Ethereum back into dollars, you still owe 100 USDC in borrowed dollars because the difference is what you owe. So if it goes down, you have to pay. Does that make sense to everybody? Any hands in the audience? Okay, so by following that logic and selling 150 borrowed USDC to ETH, we are now long ETH 150 US dollars, okay? So that's our long position on ETH. So now we have to set up a second position in order to counteract that $150 value ETH long. So the second position is going to need to be $150 ETH short. So then we'll be delta neutral after both these positions have been set up. This is essentially a hedge position, okay? So we're hedging. So guys, in this case, we're gonna enter 100 USDC into a 3x ETH USDC position. And in this case, we're gonna be borrowing ETH instead of USDC. So we take 300 USDC and we borrow $600 worth of ETH. And then we get a 900 USDC valued total position. And in order for this to work out, just like in the last one, we're going to need $450 worth of USDC, $450 worth of ETH to start with. So because we have 300 USDC and 600 ETH borrowed, we're going to have to use our borrowed ETH in order to buy USDC. So the total position being 450 ETH and 450 USDC means that we have a difference in our starting capital of 300 USDC and $600 worth of ETH of 150 USDC that's going to need to be added to the USDC side. So that 150 USDC is going to be subtracted from our ETH borrowed capital. So we're going to take 150 of our $600 worth of borrowed ETH, and we're going to buy USDC. And by borrowing ETH and buying USDC, what does that mean? We are now shorting Ethereum because we are now in $150 worth of bought USDC using our borrowed Ethereum. So that $150 ETH short now counteracts our $150 ETH long. And after setting up both of these positions, in theory, we should be delta neutral. In reality, we are not though. And the reason why is because we actually still have a lot of leftover borrowed funds. So even after this, we still have a $600 worth of borrowed ETH that will need to be repaid at the end of this venture. And we will have 100 USDC or 200 USDC that will also need to be repaid. So if you go to Franconium, you'll notice that there still are like certain periods of financial movement that would lead to you being liquidated from this position due to the fact that your borrowed funds would basically, you would lose collateral for them. So you have to keep in mind that these positions are not foolproof. You also can do this on other accounts. Like, you don't have to use Franconium. You could set up this position on almost any other yield farm application. Just Franconium is made for it. And any other yield farming application, you'd have to set up two different positions. It's a bit more precarious because you'd have to handle both these positions individually and calculate, when you would be liquidated, and, you'd have to move your funds appropriately. But this is essentially how to minimize exposure to the market when yield farming.